What's going on, guys? This time I'm gonna take you into my process and how I set up my nodes. I'm not using any templates as I personally like to start working with a blank canvas, but you can definitely save this workflow for later and apply it to your own shots. Anyway, let's open up Resolve and get to it. Alright, so let's start with importing the folder with the RA footage into our master bin and set up our timeline as I showed you in the previous video. Next, we're gonna open up our project settings, go to the color management tab, and set our color transforms to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, just to make sure that what we see in our viewer stay consistent with our final export. Okay, so let's start with this clip, which is shot on an Arri Alexa with the color profile lock C3. So let's rename this first node to CST or color space transform, and then going into the effects tab on the right side. Search for color space transform and drag this onto our node. In the effects tool we see a couple of things we need to know, like our inputs and outputs. So in this case we already know our input is coming from an Arri, so let's select our color space Arri Y gamut. The footage is shot in profile or gamma Arri log C3, so let's select this as our input gamma. So you already see that the image transforms from log to Rec 709. We did not change the output yet from a color space transform, but the outputs are already linked to our timeline settings, which we set up in the beginning to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. For me, I always want to make sure I'm transforming my footage to the correct color space, so normally I still select Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4 as my output values. And that's it. This is a simple way to give you a starting point for our base grade. If we choose a different input color space, it will still work, but it will not give us the most out of the data we're working with. The reason why we use the correct technical transform is to have as much detail and dynamic range as the camera is capable to capture. There are different ways to apply color management, but for now let's just stick with this one, the node base color space transform. Okay, so now let's set up the rest of a node tree by adding a serial node before the CST by clicking Shift S. And let's rename this node to exposure. Just make sure that our CST is always at the end of the node tree to get a better understanding of the basics right now. Looking at the scopes, we can see that our levels are a bit underexposed, so this first node we're gonna use for balancing our main exposure levels. To keep it simple, we're gonna use our priming wheels for this one. Make sure to eyeball the scopes while adjusting the offset wheel. We can also adjust the lift, gamma or gain a bit to balance it out and show some more information in the shadows, for example. Let's create a couple more nodes by clicking Alt or Option S. And let's call the second one white balance. The easiest way to do this is by selecting the white balance qualifier and then click something what should be white in your image. So in this case our talent sweater. Normally we could use something like a white car, but for now this will work. Let's check out the before and after by clicking Command or Control D and keep watching the scopes. It looks pretty good as we can see our RGB values pulled more towards each other. And there are a couple ways to see if we are white balanced correctly, like using the waveform and see if the red, green and blue channel are lining up. If it's not matching, we can change it by adjusting the temp or tint slider in the primings to balance it out. We can use the third node for other corrections if needed, like saturation or contrast, but let's leave this one empty for now. If we look at our talent skin tones, it's a bit on the magenta side, so we're going to fix this on the next one. Click on the fourth node and let's create a parallel node by clicking on Alt or Option P. So this parallel node will give us the output from the previous corrections, which is coming from our node before, and let us do a separate adjustment which get combined after our parallel mixer. So basically this means we can stack color adjustments which are coming from our corrected image, combine them, and then we can put our mood on top of that. So for instance, this empty node will output our previous adjustments, and if we change something in this one, for instance, pulling the offset, you see that all other nodes get affected as well. If you reset this one and we're going to apply some changes to the top one, you see that it will not affect the one below this. So this means basically we can do multiple adjustments from our output and then combining it and sending it to our next node. Back to our top parallel node, and let's rename this to remap. And even though we're going to adjust the skin tone here, we create a separate node later to isolate the skin. But at this point we're still correcting, so let's check out how to create a realistic skin tone. Open up a vector scope, click on the settings and turn on the show skin tone indicator. This line represents the skin tone for all skin colors. Let's start shifting only a skin tone by going into the color warper and drag onto the talent skin. Make sure you have the qualifier selected. As you can see in the scopes, we can adjust the hue and align this with our skin tone indicator. We can also pull down the saturation a bit by dragging the skin tone selection more towards the middle. If it changes other colors from our image, we can set more points to get a cleaner and better selection. But I think this looks pretty good for training purposes, so let's remap another color so you understand the process with the color warper. Select the second parallel node and let's rename this node to saturation. Let's drag onto this cyan color and pull out a bit of saturation. It's basically all about minor corrections to balance the image out and to create a steady base for our grade. After our parallel mixer, we can add a new node and let's call this one look. To keep it simple and get you started, let's just focus on the primary wheels and feel free to play around with the lift, gamma and gain till you have something you like or what will emphasize the story. So let's start with adding some cyan into the gain and adding some warm tones into the gamma, the midtones, where also the skin tone is based. We can counter this with the lift as well. This is a simple method to quickly balance the image with just the primaries. So after our look node, let's add another one and call this one look adjustments. And let's go to the lock wheels on the primaries. Let's say we want a bit more filmish look. So let's start with adding some green or cyan tones into our highlights. To define the highlight range, we can adjust the range slider on top. So let's do the same for the shadows. And that's how you set up a basic node tree. We start out with our color space transform, which we put at the end. And now we're gonna start color correcting or balancing our image. And after our color correcting, we can start with our look adjustments. But before we wrap up, let's check out a simple trick to give the talent a bit more character. Select our last node in the parallel mixer and add a new one. Let's rename this node to skin and let's go to the isolation tool. Drag onto the talent skin till you have a pretty good isolation. Press Shift H to activate the highlight mode. And you can do some adjustments in hue, saturation and luminance to fine-tune your selection. Open up the blur and the denoiser a bit. Also, let's use the power window tool to make sure we're only affecting the talent's face, like I showed in the previous video, and let's track this selection. As we have the talent skin separate, we could also do some hue adjustments like we did in the first parallel node, but for this one let's just add a bit of sharpness. So going to the blur page, open up the sharpener a bit, and let's add some heavier contrast with the midtone detail slider, so his face grabs more attention of the viewer. Thanks guys, that's it for now. I've provided some extra clips in the downloaded folder for you to practice, and I'm looking forward to work with you in the live sessions.